A young billionaire saved newborn twin girls from a snowstorm, but what he discovered about them made him cry. The snowstorm howled with relentless fury, turning the landscape into a white, chaotic whirlwind. Thomas Laurent, the 32-year-old young billionaire, watched nature's frenzy through the massive windows of his mansion. His green eyes, usually calculating and cold, reflected an unusual restlessness. Something about the night felt different, as though fate itself was about to knock on his door. The piercing sound of the intercom shattered the silence of the mansion, startling Thomas. Who could possibly be at the gate on a night like this? Intrigued and slightly apprehensive, he made his way to the security panel. The cameras showed nothing but snow and darkness. Frowning, Thomas activated the microphone. "Who's there?" His authoritative voice echoed through the system, but there was no answer. Only the howling wind responded to his call. Driven by a curiosity he couldn't quite explain, Thomas grabbed his thickest coat and ventured outside. The biting wind whipped his face the moment he opened the door, but he pushed on, walking with difficulty toward the gate. That was when he heard it, a weak sound, almost imperceptible amid the storm. A cry, no, two distinct cries, small and desperate. Thomas's heart quickened. His steps became faster, more urgent. When he finally reached the gate, his eyes widened at the sight before him. There, in the quickly accumulating snow, were two tiny bundles, one wrapped in a pink blanket, the other in a blue one, moving ever so slightly. Thomas knelt, his hands trembling not only from the cold but also from the realization of what he was seeing. Babies, two small children, twins by the look of them, abandoned in the snow like little angels fallen from the sky. Carefully, he pulled back the blankets from their faces. Two pairs of eyes gazed back at him, wide and frightened. Their tiny lips quivered in the cold, their cries now weaker, as though losing the strength to fight the relentless chill. "My God," Thomas murmured, his voice thick with emotion. That was when he noticed a note precariously pinned to one of the blankets. With trembling fingers, he picked it up and read the words that would change his life forever. "Take care of them. Once everything is settled, I'll return." Those simple words hit him like a punch to the gut. Thomas felt his legs weaken, and before he could stop himself, hot tears began streaming down his face, mingling with the snow that fell unceasingly. For a moment, he was frozen in place, overwhelmed by emotion. All his life, Thomas Laurent had been the epitome of control and rationality. Every decision, every move, meticulously calculated to maximize success and profit. But now, faced with these two tiny, defenseless beings, all his defenses crumbled. The cry of one of the babies snapped him back to reality. There was no time to hesitate. With a determination that surprised even himself, Thomas gathered the two children in his arms, holding them tightly against his chest. The trek back to the mansion was an epic battle against the elements. The wind seemed determined to tear the children from his arms. The snow threatened to blind him with every step. But Thomas pressed on, shielding the babies with his own body. His tears now mixed with the melted snow on his face. By the time he reached the mansion door, Thomas was exhausted, soaked, and trembling. But the children were safe, their tiny bodies warmed by his own. Inside the luxurious mansion, Thomas found himself momentarily at a loss. What now? His gaze swept across the impeccably decorated rooms, all as cold and impersonal as he himself had once been. Nothing there seemed suitable to shelter two fragile, precious lives. Making a quick decision, he took the twins to his own bedroom. Gently, he placed them on his king-size bed, surrounding them with pillows so they wouldn't roll off. Their small faces were red from the cold, and Thomas could see they needed immediate care. Without a second thought, he grabbed his phone and called his personal physician. "Dr. Evans, I need you here right now. It's an emergency," he said, his usually steady voice now trembling with worry. While he waited, Thomas tried to soothe the babies. Awkwardly, he rocked them, murmuring comforting words he never imagined he would say. "It's all right, little ones. You're safe now. I'll take care of you." The words came out of his mouth before he could stop them, and the realization struck him like lightning. He, Thomas Laurent, the man who had always put business above everything else, was promising to care for 2 abandoned children. The idea was absurd, unthinkable, and yet, looking at those innocent faces, he knew he couldn't do otherwise. Dr. Evans arrived in record time, carrying a medical kit. His eyes widened at the unexpected scene. The powerful Thomas Laurent, sitting on his bed, clumsily holding 2 newborn babies. "Mr. Laurent, what?" the doctor began, but Thomas interrupted him. "Later, doctor. Please, examine them first." The examination was quick and efficient. Dr. Evans checked vital signs, temperature, and the twins' general condition. "They're surprisingly well considering the circumstances," he concluded. "A bit dehydrated, but nothing that can't be fixed quickly. They seem to be only a few days old." Thomas exhaled a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "What do we need to do?" The doctor gave detailed instructions on feeding, hydration, and basic care. Thomas listened intently, absorbing every word as though his life depended on it, and in a way, now it did. "Mr. Laurent," Dr. Evans said hesitantly, "we need to notify the authorities. These children were clearly abandoned and—" "No," Thomas interrupted abruptly. His mind raced, trying to process everything. "Not yet. Harrison, I need time to think." The doctor looked at him with concern but reluctantly nodded. "I understand, but we can't delay for long. These children need a home, proper care." Thomas glanced at the twins, now sleeping peacefully on his bed. Something inside him tightened, an emotion he couldn't name. "They have a home," he said softly. "Here. With me." The words came out before he could think, surprising both himself and the doctor. But the moment he said them, Thomas knew they were true. No matter how illogical or impractical it seemed, he couldn't abandon these children, not after saving them from the storm. Dr. Evans studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Mr. Laurent, I realize this situation is unusual, but I must remind you of the legal implications. We at least need to notify the hospital and the police, do more thorough tests." Thomas nodded slowly, his mind already working on possible solutions. "All right, doctor. We'll take the twins to the hospital in the morning, but please, be discreet. I don't want this turning into a media circus." After the doctor left, Thomas found himself alone with the twins. The mansion's silence, once so familiar and comforting, now felt oppressive. He watched the 2 of them breathe softly, their serene expressions a stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions consuming him. Carefully, he touched one baby's face, marveling at the softness of her skin. "Who are you?" he murmured. "Where did you come from? And why? Why do I feel like you were meant to find me?" His questions went unanswered, echoing only in his mind. Thomas knew the coming days would be a challenge like none he had ever faced. But gazing at those innocent faces, he felt a determination grow within him. He would protect them, care for them, until he could uncover the truth behind their mysterious appearance. The next morning, Thomas woke with a start, momentarily confused by the soft cries filling his bedroom. For a second, he wondered if it had all been a vivid dream. But then his eyes fell on the 2 small bundles on his bed, and reality hit with full force. It hadn't been a dream. The twins were there, very real, and urgently needing care. With a mix of anxiety and determination, Thomas rose and began preparations to take them to the hospital. He improvised carriers with padded baskets, wrapped the babies in warm blankets, and for the first time in years, drove his own car instead of calling his driver. The hospital was relatively quiet that winter morning. Thomas had made arrangements to be received discreetly, avoiding the most crowded areas. Even so, he couldn't escape the curious and surprised looks from the staff when they saw the famous billionaire carrying 2 newborns. Dr. Evans was waiting for them, having organized a trusted team to conduct the necessary exams. The next few hours were a whirlwind of tests, blood work, health checks, and countless questions Thomas barely knew how to answer. "Mr. Laurent," a nurse approached him gently. "We need to register the babies. Do they have names?" Thomas blinked, realizing he hadn't even considered that. Names. Something so fundamental, and he had no idea. "I haven't decided yet," he answered, feeling strangely inadequate. The nurse smiled sympathetically. "Don't worry, that's common in cases of, well, situations like this. We can use temporary names for the records if you prefer." Thomas nodded, grateful for her understanding. As he watched the twins being examined, his thoughts turned to the mysterious note. "When everything is settled, I'll return." What did that mean? Who was this person, and why had they chosen to leave the children with him? His thoughts were interrupted by Dr. Evans's arrival, carrying a stack of papers. "Mr. Laurent, we have the preliminary results." Thomas straightened, feeling his heart pound. "And? The twins are surprisingly healthy, considering the circumstances," the doctor began. "As we suspected, they're slightly dehydrated, but that's already being treated. There are no signs of abuse or neglect prior to last night's incident." Thomas exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. That's great," he murmured. Dr. Evans hesitated before continuing. "However, Mr. Laurent, there's another issue we need to discuss. We didn't find any records of these children in our system. No hospital in the region has any record of twins born in the last few days that match their descriptions." The implication hung heavily in the air. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. "What does that mean, doctor?" "It means these children officially don't exist," the doctor replied gravely. "No birth certificates, no prior medical records. It's as if they simply appeared." The mystery surrounding the twins deepened, and Thomas felt the weight of responsibility grow heavier on his shoulders. "So now what? What's the next step?" "Legally, we're required to notify the authorities," Dr. Evans explained. "The police will need to investigate the abandonment case, and social services will be involved to determine the best course of action for the children." Thomas felt a wave of panic at the thought of the twins being taken to some impersonal shelter, far from his care. What if I want to take care of them? Temporarily, of course, until their parents are found. The doctor looked at him with a mixture of surprise and concern. "Mr. Laurent, I understand your desire to help, but caring for 2 newborns is no simple task, especially for someone with your responsibilities." Thomas knew the doctor was right. His life was complicated, full of commitments and obligations that left little room for caring for himself, let alone 2 helpless children. But something within him rebelled at the idea of abandoning them now. "I understand the challenges, Doctor," Thomas said, his voice firm with a resolve that surprised even him. "But I feel a responsibility toward these children. I was the one who found them, who saved them from the storm. I can't just turn them over and pretend none of this happened." Dr. Evans studied him for a long moment, before slowly nodding. "I understand your perspective, Mr. Laurent, but I must warn you, the process won't be easy. There will be investigations, questions, potential legal complications." "I'm prepared to face that," Thomas answered, surprised by his own determination. "I'll do whatever it takes to ensure these children's well-being." In the hours that followed, Thomas was caught in a whirlwind of bureaucracy and questioning. The police were notified, and detectives arrived at the hospital to gather information about the mysterious case. Thomas repeated his story countless times, describing in detail the stormy night and the unexpected encounter at his mansion's gate. Meanwhile, social workers arrived to assess the situation. Thomas watched anxiously as they examined the twins and took notes on their clipboards. He answered a seemingly endless series of questions about his life, his routine, and his intentions for the children. As the day wore on, Thomas felt exhaustion settling in, but his resolve never wavered. He made calls to his lawyers, instructing them to begin whatever legal process was necessary to make him the twins' temporary guardian. Finally, by nightfall, a preliminary decision was reached. Due to the unusual circumstances and Thomas's willingness to assume responsibility, the authorities agreed to let him take the twins home, under the strict supervision of social services. Exhausted but hugely relieved, Thomas prepared to leave the hospital with his new charges. As he waited for the final paperwork to be signed, he looked at the two small lives now depending on him. "I don't know what the future holds," he murmured softly to the sleeping twins, "but I promise I'll do everything I can to protect and care for you." As he left the hospital carrying the twins in his arms, Thomas felt the weight of the responsibility he had assumed, but alongside that weight came an unexpected sense of purpose and determination. For the first time in a long while, he felt he was doing something truly meaningful. The drive back to the mansion was quiet, punctuated only by the soft sounds of the baby's breathing. Thomas glanced at the rearview mirror, seeing the tiny car seats his assistants had hastily provided. The sight made him smile, despite his fatigue. When he arrived home, Thomas was greeted by an anxious staff, all curious to see the mansion's new inhabitants. He gave concise instructions, asking them to prepare a suitable room for the twins and to make a list of everything necessary to care for two newborns. That night, while the twins slept peacefully in improvised cribs next to his bed, Thomas lay awake, contemplating the drastic change in his life in less than 24 hours. He knew the coming days would be full of challenges, unanswered questions, and likely sleepless nights. But as he looked at the serene faces of the twins, Thomas felt a wave of emotion he couldn't name. It was a mix of fear, excitement, and something deeper, something he hadn't felt in a very long time: hope. With that thought, Thomas finally allowed himself to relax. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and discoveries, but for now, in this moment of calm before the storm that would surely come, he allowed himself to feel the peace of knowing he had done the right thing. And so, with the soft sounds of the twins' breathing filling the room, Thomas Laurent, the billionaire who thought he had everything under control, fell asleep, unaware that his greatest adventure was only beginning. The stillness of the night was suddenly shattered by a sharp cry, quickly followed by another. Thomas Laurent opened his eyes, momentarily disoriented. For a second, he wondered if he was dreaming, but reality soon hit him. The twins were awake and, by the sound of it, very unhappy. Stumbling in the darkness, Thomas turned on a bedside lamp and walked over to the improvised cribs. Two pairs of eyes stared at him, bright with tears. Okay, he murmured, his voice rough with sleep. "What do you need?" "Hungry." "Dirty diaper." Picking up one baby, he grimaced as he felt a heavy diaper. "Right, diaper change first." Gently, he placed the baby on the bed and went to retrieve the supplies his staff had purchased in a rush. What seemed like a simple task, changing a diaper, turned into an epic battle. Thomas, who could negotiate multi-million-dollar contracts without breaking a sweat, now found himself completely lost in a sea of snaps and adhesive strips. Why doesn't this? Oh, I see. After several minutes of struggle, he finally managed to change the diaper, though he wasn't sure it was on perfectly. The baby, however, seemed more comfortable. But as soon as he finished with one, the other began crying even louder. "Okay, your turn," Thomas sighed, picking up the second twin. The night dragged on in a seemingly endless cycle of diaper changes, clumsy attempts to prepare bottles, and moments of pure panic when the babies cried for no apparent reason. By the time the sun finally rose, Thomas was exhausted, disheveled, and covered in suspicious stains on his silk shirt. Looking at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, he barely recognized himself. "What have I gotten myself into?" he muttered. But then he heard a small coo from the bedroom. Returning, he saw one of the twins smiling at him, a gummy, drool-filled grin. And in that moment, all the exhaustion seemed worth it. The following days were a roller coaster of emotions and challenges. Thomas tried to balance his business responsibilities with the constant care the twins demanded. Video conferences were frequently interrupted by baby cries, and he found himself giving important presentations with a baby in his arms and milk stains on his tie. After a particularly challenging week, Thomas realized he needed professional help. Following extensive research and countless interviews, he hired Maria, an experienced nanny with decades of experience caring for twins. Maria arrived like a saving angel, bringing order to the chaos the mansion had become. She taught Thomas the basics of infant care, from how to properly hold a bottle to techniques for soothing late-night cries. "Mr. Laurent," Maria said one day as she watched Thomas rock one of the twins with surprising skill, "you're doing very well. These little ones are lucky to have you." Thomas looked down at the baby in his arms, feeling that wave of emotion once again. "I think I'm the lucky one, Maria." With Maria's help, Thomas began to establish a routine. Mornings were dedicated to the twins, feeding, changing, playtime. Afternoons were for work, with Maria taking over the primary care. Evenings, however, Thomas insisted on spending with the babies, reading to them, singing off-key lullabies, and simply enjoying their company. It was during one of these quiet nights that Thomas finally named the twins. Looking at their angelic faces, he whispered, "Claire and Anne." The names came naturally, as though the babies themselves had chosen them. "Claire," he said, gently tapping the nose of the baby on his left, "because you brighten my days like a clear morning sun." Turning to the other, he smiled. "And Anne, because you bring grace to my life in ways I never imagined possible." The twins seemed to approve of their new names, responding with happy smiles and gurgles. At that moment, Thomas felt his heart swell in a way he had never experienced before. They were no longer just two abandoned babies he was temporarily caring for. They were Claire and Anne, two little lives entwined with his in irrevocable ways. However, as his attachment to the twins grew, so did his curiosity and concern about their origins. Who were their biological parents? Why were they abandoned? And, more importantly, was anyone searching for them? Determined to find answers, Thomas hired a team of renowned private detectives. He gave them clear instructions: investigate discreetly, leaving no stone unturned in the search for the truth about Claire and Anne. While waiting for the first reports from the detectives, Thomas devoted himself completely to caring for the twins. Each day brought new challenges and small victories. He learned to distinguish different types of crying, to prepare formula one-handed while holding a baby in the other, and even to change diapers with surprising efficiency. One afternoon, as he played with Claire and Anne on the living room rug, Thomas received a call from the lead detective. His heart raced as he answered the phone. "Mr. Laurent," the detective's voice was serious. "We have some preliminary information to share with you. I'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss it in person." Thomas looked at the twins, now attempting to crawl in opposite directions. "Yes, of course," he replied, his voice betraying a mixture of anxiety and hope. "Can you come to the mansion tomorrow morning?" That night, Thomas could hardly sleep. His mind whirled with possibilities. Had they discovered something about the twins' biological parents, or perhaps a clue about why they had been abandoned? The hours crept by until morning. When the detective arrived, Thomas received him in his office, closing the door with a worried glance at Maria, who was caring for the twins in the next room. "Mr. Laurent," the detective began, his face somber, "we've completed our initial investigation and, well, there's no easy way to say this. We found absolutely nothing." Thomas blinked, confused. "What do you mean, nothing?" The detective sighed, opening a thick folder. "We've checked every birth record in the region from the past few months. No pair of twins matches Claire and Anne. We expanded the search to hospitals across the country. Nothing. We've checked missing persons reports, adoption records, even human trafficking networks. It's as if these children simply never existed before they appeared at your door." Thomas sank into his chair, his mind spinning with the implications. That's impossible. They must have come from somewhere. Surely someone out there is looking for them. The detective shook his head. If they are, they left no trace. Mr. Laurent, in all my years of work, I've never seen a case like this. It's as though someone meticulously erased any record of these children. The words hung heavily in the air. Thomas stood and walked to the window. Outside, he could see Maria playing with Claire and Anne in the garden. The twins were laughing, completely unaware of the mystery surrounding them. "What does this mean for them, for me?" Thomas asked quietly. The detective hesitated before answering. "Legally, this complicates matters. Without official records, the process of adoption or permanent guardianship will be challenging. On the other hand, it also means that for the time being, no one has any legal claim over them besides you." Thomas turned, surprised. "You're saying I could keep them?" "It's a possibility," the detective confirmed. "But Mr. Laurent, I must caution you, this mystery surrounding the twins' origins, it won't simply go away. There will always be questions, always a risk that someone from their past might show up one day." Thomas turned his gaze back to the garden, watching Claire try to catch a butterfly while Anne laughed at her attempts. His heart tightened with a mix of love and fear. After the detective left, Thomas spent hours contemplating his situation. The mystery around Claire and Anne had only deepened, leaving more questions than answers. He found himself struggling with conflicting emotions, the desire to protect and raise the twins, and the guilt at potentially depriving them of their true family. That night, as he put Claire and Anne to bed, Thomas made a decision. Gazing at their sleeping faces, he whispered a promise. "No matter where you came from, no matter what the future holds, I will be here. I'll protect you, love you, and do everything I can to give you the best life possible. And if one day we do discover the truth about your origins, we'll face it together as a family." With that promise, Thomas felt a new sense of purpose fill him. The mystery of Claire and Anne's origins still loomed, but he was determined not to let it overshadow the joy and love the twins had brought into his life. As he quietly closed the door to the twins' room, Thomas knew the road ahead would be full of challenges, but looking back at the small cribs where Claire and Anne slept peacefully, he also knew that every challenge, every sleepless night, every moment of uncertainty would be worth it. With a determined sigh, Thomas returned to his office. There was much work to do, legal arrangements to be made, investigations to continue, and a new life to build. But for the first time in his life, Thomas Laurent felt he was exactly where he should be, doing exactly what he should be doing. And that, more than any business success, made him feel truly fulfilled. As the night wore on, Thomas stayed in his office, immersed in thoughts and plans for the future. He knew the next days, weeks, and months would be crucial to establishing a solid foundation for his new family. With renewed determination, he began listing all the necessary steps, consulting attorneys specializing in adoption, gathering the paperwork for legal guardianship of the twins, and continuing the investigations into their origins, albeit discreetly. Thomas also realized he would have to make significant changes in his professional life. He started considering delegating more responsibilities, reducing his working hours, and even rethinking some of his business priorities. The twins were now his #1 priority, and he was willing to make the adjustments needed to be the father Claire and Anne deserved. While organizing his thoughts, Thomas heard a soft cry coming from the twins' room. Without hesitation, he got up and went to them. Anne was awake, her little eyes shining in the dim light of the room. Gently, Thomas picked her up, rocking her softly. "It's all right, little one," he whispered. "Daddy's here." The words came naturally, and Thomas realized it was the first time he referred to himself as Daddy. The realization hit him hard, bringing tears to his eyes. As he calmed Anne, Thomas glanced at Claire, still sleeping peacefully. In that moment, he knew with absolute certainty that no matter what the future held, these two girls were now his family. He would protect them, love them, and do everything in his power to ensure they had a safe and happy life. With Anne now asleep in his arms, Thomas couldn't bring himself to put her back in the crib right away. Instead, he sat in the armchair in the corner of the room, holding the little one against his chest. There, in the stillness of the night, lulled by the soft breathing of his daughters, Thomas Laurent, the powerful billionaire, the relentless businessman, finally allowed himself to relax completely. He knew the challenges were only beginning, that the mystery surrounding the twins' origins still hung over them, but at that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered were the two small hearts beating in sync with his own. What mattered was the unconditional love he felt for these two little lives fate had entrusted to him. And so, with a smile on his lips and his heart full of a love he never imagined he could feel, Thomas fell asleep in the armchair, holding Anne in his arms as Claire slept peacefully in her crib. The chapter of their lives as a family was only beginning, and Thomas could hardly wait to see what the future had in store for them. As the weeks went by, Thomas Laurent found himself immersed in a world he had never imagined for himself. Late nights spent working in his office were replaced by hours rocking Claire and Anne, singing off-key lullabies, and making up bedtime stories on the fly. Every morning, Thomas created a special routine for the twins. After breakfast, he took them for a stroll through the mansion's expansive gardens. Claire, always curious, reached out her tiny hands to touch every flower and leaf within reach. Annie, on the other hand, seemed more fascinated by the sky, her eyes always turned upward as if trying to decipher the secrets of the clouds. "Look at my little explorers," Thomas would say, his voice full of affection. "Someday I'll show you the entire world." In the afternoons, it was reading time. Thomas transformed a cozy corner of the library into a nest of pillows and soft blankets. There, with a twin on each arm, he read fairy tales, fables, and even simplified excerpts from literary classics. "It's never too early to appreciate a good book," he'd murmur, noticing how wide the girl's eyes would get at the colorful illustrations. As the weeks turned into months, the twins' unique personalities began to emerge in ways that fascinated and surprised Thomas. Claire was the adventurous one. The moment she learned to crawl, there wasn't a corner of the mansion she wouldn't try to explore. Thomas often found her in unlikely spots, under tables or behind curtains, always sporting a mischievous grin. "You're going to turn my hair grey before I'm 40, you know?" Thomas would laugh, fishing Claire out from behind a potted plant. Anne, on the other hand, was the quiet observer. She could spend hours sitting and studying a toy or watching the people around her with surprising intensity for someone so young. Thomas often found himself lost in Anne's thoughtful gaze, wondering about the worlds she saw. "What goes on in that little head of yours, he would ask softly, receiving only a serene smile that melted his heart. The differences between the twins weren't limited to behavior. Claire had a voracious appetite and loved trying new foods, while Anne was more selective, often preferring to play with her food rather than eat it. During mealtimes, Thomas found himself bargaining with Anne. "How about one more spoonful for the mommy you never knew?" The dark humor sometimes surprised him, a reminder of their unique situation. At night, after putting the twins to bed, Thomas often stood at the bedroom door watching them sleep. In those quiet moments, he reflected on how drastically his life had changed in such a short time. Before Claire and Anne, his existence revolved around acquisitions, mergers, and the relentless expansion of his business empire. Now his greatest victories were the twins' smiles, their first hesitant steps, the babbling that almost sounded like Dada. "How did you two manage to turn my world upside down?" he'd whisper into the darkness of the room. The answer, of course, came in the form of soft breathing and the occasional contented sigh from the sleeping babies. As his bond with the twins grew, Thomas began to seriously consider the possibility of adoption. The idea of making Claire and Anne officially his daughters filled him with a joy he could hardly contain. Imagining a future where he'd drive them to school, attend dance recitals, and watch them grow into strong, independent women filled his heart with love and pride. Yet along with those dreams came ethical concerns that kept him awake at night. What if the twins' biological parents were still out there, searching for them? What if one day they showed up, demanding their daughters back? The thought of losing Claire and Anne was unbearable. There was also the question of his own suitability as a father. He was a businessman, used to dealing with contracts and figures, not diapers and lullabies. Could he really provide the love and care these children deserved? "You deserve the best," Thomas would murmur to the sleeping twins. "Am I that person?" Despite these doubts, Thomas couldn't deny the profound bond that had formed between him and the twins. Every smile, every cuddle, every moment of connection reinforced his conviction that somehow they were destined to be a family. One night, while soothing Anne after a nightmare, Thomas made another decision. Gazing into the baby's sleepy eyes, he made a silent promise. "I don't know what the future holds, little one. But I promise, as long as I breathe, I will do everything in my power to give you and your sister all the love and security you deserve. We're a family now, no matter what happens." With that promise, Thomas felt a peacefulness settle over his heart. The road ahead was still uncertain, full of legal and emotional challenges. But one thing was clear. Claire and Anne were now the center of his world, and he would do anything to protect and nurture the special bond they'd created. In the days that followed, Thomas began to seriously consider adoption. He scheduled appointments with specialized attorneys and sought information about the process, even though he wasn't yet ready to take that definitive step. One afternoon, while playing with the twins on the living room rug, Thomas had a moment of clarity. Claire was trying to reach a colorful toy, stretching her chubby arms as far as they would go. Anne, meanwhile, watched her sister with curiosity, her large eyes fixed on Claire's efforts. In that instant, observing the determination and curiosity of his daughters, Thomas realized he was witnessing something precious. Just as the twins were discovering the world around them, he was learning to be a father. There would be challenges and uncertainties along the way, but the key was to remain present, to keep loving. "You can do it, Claire," he encouraged softly, moving the toy a bit closer. "Daddy's here if you need help." With a grunt of effort, Claire finally grabbed the toy, letting out a squeal of delight. Anne, not wanting to miss out, started clapping, grinning from ear to ear at her sister and Thomas. "My clever girls," he whispered, leaning in to kiss both their foreheads. "You're amazing." In that moment, Thomas knew with absolute certainty that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Claire and Anne weren't just the babies fate had placed in his care, they were the daughters his heart had chosen. With that certainty, Thomas scooped both of them up in his arms, one on each side, and walked to the window. The late afternoon sun shone gently into the room, bathing it in a golden light, as if celebrating the love and unity of this unlikely little family. The future was still uncertain, and the decision about adoption still weighed on his mind. But Thomas Laurent, the man who once believed everything in life could be controlled and calculated, now embraced the unknown with courage and hope. Because he knew that with Claire and Anne in his life, any challenge could be overcome. Together, they would write their own story of love, family and belonging, one day at a time, one precious moment after another. Thomas Laurent was in his office, immersed in a stack of documents related to Claire and Anne's legal care, when his phone rang. He recognized the number. It was Johnson Teague, the private detective he had hired to investigate the twins' origins. "Mr. Laurent?" Johnson's voice sounded tense on the other end of the line. "We've got something that might be relevant to your case." Thomas's heart pounded. After months with no concrete leads, any new information was like water in a desert. "What did you find, Johnson?" "There's a missing person case in Millbrook, a town about 60 miles from here. A young woman and 2 newborns disappeared a few months ago." Silence hung on the line for a moment as Thomas processed the information. His mind began making quick connections. "You think it could be related to the twins?" "It's possible, sir. The dates seem to line up, and the description of the babies is similar. I thought you'd want to know right away." Thomas thanked the detective and ended the call, his mind racing with possibilities. He stood and walked to the window, gazing at the vast garden where Claire and Anne often played under Maria's watchful eye. It could be just a coincidence, but something in his gut told him this lead was worth pursuing in person. Over the next few days, Thomas meticulously prepared for the trip. He spent hours with Maria, the nanny, leaving detailed instructions for the twins' care. Every routine, every preference of Claire and Anne was carefully noted and explained. "Maria," Thomas said, handing her a thick folder, "here's a list of all emergency contacts. My number is at the top. Don't hesitate to call me for any reason, day or night." Maria nodded, her serious expression reflecting the importance of the situation. "Don't worry, Mr. Laurent. I'll take care of the girls as if they were my own." Thomas smiled gratefully. Maria's dedication had been a godsend these past months, and he knew he could trust her completely. On the morning of his departure, Thomas spent extra time with the twins. He hugged them tightly, inhaling the sweet baby scent that had become an essential part of his life without his even realizing it. "Daddy will be back soon," he murmured, kissing their soft foreheads. "Be good for Maria, okay?" Claire responded with a happy gurgle, while Anne gripped Thomas's finger tightly as if unwilling to let him go. The innocent gesture almost made Thomas cancel the trip, but he knew he had to follow this lead. It was all for them, after all. With a heavy heart, Thomas got into his car and headed for Millbrook. The 2-hour drive felt endless, his mind alternating between anxiety at leaving the twins and hope of finally finding some answers about their origins. Millbrook was a small, picturesque town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else by name, and gossip traveled faster than the internet. Thomas parked his luxury car in the town square, immediately aware of the curious looks from the locals. He knew he would have to be discreet in his investigations. His first stop was the local cafe, a popular meeting spot where town gossip often circulated. Sitting at the counter, he ordered a coffee and began chatting casually with the waitress. "First time in Millbrook?" she asked, refilling his steaming mug. Thomas nodded, offering a friendly smile. "Yes, I'm thinking of moving to a smaller town. What's life like around here?" The waitress, whose name tag read Betty, smiled back. "Oh, it's a great place to live. Quiet, safe. Everybody knows each other." "Sounds ideal," Thomas commented, taking a sip of coffee. After a calculated pause, he added, "Though I did hear something about a recent disappearance. That's not common around here, is it?" Betty's smile faltered for a moment, and Thomas realized he'd touched on a sensitive subject. "Oh, you must mean Sophie and the babies," she said, lowering her voice. Yes, it was quite a shock. Thomas felt his heart rate spike at hearing the name Sophie, but he kept his expression neutral. Must have been terrible for the family. Betty glanced around as though making sure no one was listening before leaning closer. It was quite the scandal. Sophie was always a good girl, but that husband of hers, well, people talk, you know. Thomas raised an eyebrow, encouraging her to continue. "Eric, her husband, he's got a temper," Betty whispered. "There were rumors of problems at home, if you get what I mean. But no one expected Sophie to just disappear like that, especially with newborn babies." Thomas thanked Betty for the information and left the cafe, his mind racing. The name Sophie and the mention of domestic trouble made his stomach turn. He needed more information, but he also knew he had to tread carefully. In a small town like Millbrook, an outsider asking too many questions would quickly draw unwanted attention. In the days that followed, Thomas roamed the town, asking discreet questions and listening to local rumors. The story of Sophie and the babies was clearly a sensitive topic, and many residents were reluctant to talk about it. He visited the local library, leafing through old newspapers in search of any mention of the disappearance. He spoke with the grocery store owner, the mailman, and even spent time at the local park, observing mothers with their babies and wondering if any of them knew Sophie. Every new piece of information Thomas gathered seemed to raise more questions than it answered. Sophie was described as a quiet, kind young woman who worked part-time at the local bookstore before marrying Eric. Eric, however, was depicted as an ambitious businessman from a nearby city, known for his explosive temper. It was on the third day of his investigation, when Thomas was on the verge of giving up hope of finding anything concrete, that he met George, an elderly man who tended the garden at the local church. "You want to know about Sophie?" George asked, his piercing blue eyes fixed on Thomas from beneath thick eyebrows. "Why?" Thomas hesitated, choosing his words carefully. He had learned that honesty, even partial honesty, often produced better results than elaborate lies. I think I may have information that could help find her." George studied him for a long moment, as if trying to read his soul, before nodding. "Come with me." The elderly man led him to a bench behind the church, far from prying ears. "Sophie was like a granddaughter to me," he began, his voice laden with emotion. "She used to help me in the garden here when she was younger. She was always a sweet girl, full of dreams." Thomas listened intently as George described how Sophie had married young to Eric, an ambitious businessman from the next town. At first, everything seemed perfect, but over time, things changed. Eric became controlling, George explained, his voice low and sad. Sophie showed up with bruises she claimed were from accidents around the house, but we knew the truth. When she got pregnant, we hoped things would improve, but... George paused, tears welling in his eyes. "The last time I saw her, Sophie was terrified. She had just given birth to twin girls and feared for their safety. She told me she was planning to run away to protect the babies." Thomas felt as if the air had been knocked from his lungs. Twins? Sophie? The revelation struck him like lightning, and he struggled to maintain his composure. "George," he said, his voice trembling, "what is Sophie's last name?" The old man looked at him, confused by the sudden urgency. "Harper. Sophie Harper. Well, that was her maiden name. After the wedding, she became Sophie Blackwood." Thomas closed his eyes, feeling the world spin around him. Sophie Harper. His Sophie. The girl he had loved in college, with whom he had planned a future before their lives took different paths. "I know her," Thomas said softly, opening his eyes to meet George's. We dated in college." George's eyes widened at the revelation. You're Thomas, the young man she always spoke about so fondly." Thomas nodded, feeling a wave of emotion wash over him. Memories of his college days with Sophie flooded his mind. Shared laughter, whispered dreams, promises of a future together that never materialized. "George," Thomas said, his voice now firm with determination, "I need you to tell me everything you know. I believe I can help Sophie and the twins." Over the next few hours, George shared every detail he could recall. The deterioration of Sophie's marriage, her growing fear of Eric, the secret plans she made to escape. "She mentioned a safe place," George said, "somewhere Eric would never find her, but she didn't tell me where it was, probably to protect me." As he listened, Thomas began piecing together the puzzle. The twins he had found on his doorstep, the mysterious note, the timing of Sophie's disappearance, it all started making a terrible sense. "George," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I think I know where Sophie and the twins are. Or at least where the twins are." The old man looked at him, hope and confusion mingling in his eyes. "What do you mean?" Thomas took a deep breath before explaining. He told George about the night he found the twins, about how he had taken them in and cared for them these past months. He described the note, his suspicions, and his fears. When he finished, George sat in silence, processing everything. "So," he finally said, "the girls are safe with you. But Sophie, she's still missing," Thomas completed the thought, "and possibly in danger." The gravity of the situation weighed on them both. Sophie had entrusted the twins to Thomas, knowing he would protect them. But by doing so, she had placed herself in a vulnerable position. "We have to find her," Thomas said, rising from the bench. "Before Eric does." George nodded, determination shining in his tired eyes. "What can we do?" Thomas thought for a moment. "First, I need to go back home. I have resources there that can help track Sophie down. I also need to ensure the twins remain safe. What about Eric? George asked, worry evident in his voice. I'll hire additional security for the mansion, Thomas replied. And I'll alert the authorities about the situation. If Eric tries anything, we'll be ready. Before leaving, Thomas exchanged contact information with George, promising to keep him updated on any developments. The old man hugged him tightly as they said goodbye. Take good care of those girls, George said, his voice quivering, and please bring Sophie home safely. Thomas nodded solemnly. I promise, George, I'll do everything in my power to protect Sophie and the twins. On the drive back, Thomas's mind was a whirl of emotions. The revelation that Sophie, his Sophie, was the twins' mother, left him reeling. Memories of his time in college with her mingled with images of the twins, forming a complex emotional tapestry in his mind. He remembered Sophie's radiant smile, how her eyes sparkled when she talked about her dreams. How could she have ended up in an abusive marriage? The thought of Sophie suffering, fearing for her life and that of her daughters, made Thomas's blood boil. As he drove, Thomas made several calls. First to Maria, ensuring the twins were well and increasing the security measures at the mansion. Then to his lawyer, explaining the situation and asking him to start preparing any documents needed to protect the twins legally. Lastly, he called Johnson, the detective. Johnson, I need you to gather all possible information on Eric Blackwood, Thomas instructed. Financial history, phone records, everything, and widen the search for Sophie. Now we know exactly who we're looking for. Arriving home, Thomas hurried to the twins' room. Seeing them, now knowing who their mother was a surreal experience. He could see Sophie's features in their tiny faces, the shape of Claire's eyes, Anne's smile. I'll bring your mum back, he promised softly, stroking the baby's soft hair as they slept. And I'll keep all three of you safe, no matter what. That night, sitting in his office surrounded by photos and documents, Thomas made a silent vow. He would find Sophie, protect the twins, and do whatever was necessary to ensure this family, his family, stayed safe and whole. The search for Sophie had only just begun, and Thomas knew the days ahead would be filled with challenges and danger. But looking at the photo of Claire and Anne on his desk, he felt a steely determination harden in his chest. For the first time in his life, Thomas Laurent had something worth fighting for that was more important than any business deal or fortune. He had a family to protect, and nothing would stop him from doing exactly that. In the days that followed, Thomas converted one of the mansion's rooms into a command center, dedicated to the search for Sophie. Maps, photos, and documents covered the walls, every piece of information carefully analyzed and connected. He hired an elite security team to protect the mansion and the twins, briefing them on the potential threat Eric posed. Security cameras were installed, and strict protocols were established to ensure Claire and Anne's safety. Meanwhile, Thomas maintained constant contact with George in Millbrook, in case any new information surfaced. He also worked closely with Johnson and his team of detectives, following every lead, no matter how small. At night, after putting the twins to bed, Thomas often found himself gazing at an old photo of Sophie he'd uncovered among his college belongings. He traced the outline of her face with his finger, recalling the happy times they'd shared and silently promising he would find her. "Where are you, Sophie?" he'd murmur to the photo. "What happened to you?" As days turned into weeks, Thomas felt the weight of responsibility grow heavier on his shoulders. Every smile from Claire, every laugh from Anne, reminded him that Sophie was missing these precious moments with her daughters. But Thomas would not give up. He knew that somewhere, Sophie was fighting to survive, to return to her daughters, and he would do whatever it took to make that possible. With one last glance at Sophie's photo, and then at the monitor displaying the twins' room, Thomas returned his attention to the documents on his desk. The night would be long, but every minute spent, every lead pursued, brought him one step closer to reuniting this unlikely family that had captured his heart. The mystery of Sophie and the twins was far from solved, but Thomas Laurent was determined to unravel it, no matter the cost. With every step he took, he drew closer not only to answers, but also to a future he had never imagined for himself. A future filled with love, family, and a deeper purpose. And so, as the night wore on and the rest of the world slept, Thomas continued his tireless search, guided by the hope and love he had found in the faces of two tiny twins and in the memory of the woman who had brought them into the world. Thomas Laurent stepped into his mansion with determined strides, his mind brimming with information and conflicting emotions after his trip to Millbrook. The silence of the house was broken by the gentle sound of childish laughter coming from the twins' room. For a moment, Thomas paused, allowing that sound to soothe him before diving headlong into the investigation awaiting him. Maria, the nanny, greeted him with a tired but warm smile. "The girls just woke up from their nap, Mr. Laurent. They missed you." Thomas nodded, grateful for Maria's dedication. "Thank you for taking such good care of them. I found some things during my trip, things that might change everything." Maria's expression was filled with concern, but she simply nodded. "I'll be here if you need anything, sir." Thomas headed to the twins' room, his heart pounding with each step. Opening the door, he was greeted by two pairs of bright eyes and toothless smiles. Claire immediately stretched her arms toward him, while Anne cooed happily from her crib. Picking Claire up, Thomas felt a wave of emotion wash over him. Now that he knew the truth about the twins' origin, every tiny feature on their faces seemed to shout Sophie. The shape of Claire's eyes, the curve of Anne's smile, small echoes of the woman he once loved and was now determined to find. "Hey, my little ones," he murmured, kissing Claire's forehead and leaning over to do the same with Anne. "Daddy's back. And I promise I'm going to bring Mommy home too." After a few precious moments with the twins, Thomas slipped away to his office. It was time to put all his resources to work. He picked up the phone and began making a series of calls. "Johnson," he said to his private detective, "I want you to assemble a full team. We need every possible piece of information on Sophie Blackwood, formerly Sophie Harper, bank records, credit card transactions, security cameras, everything, and increased surveillance on Eric Blackwood. I want to know his every move." The following hours were a blur of activity. Thomas turned one of the mansion's rooms into an improvised command center. Soon, maps, photos, and documents covered the walls, each piece of information carefully analyzed and connected. As he worked, Thomas couldn't stop his mind from drifting to the past. Memories of his college days with Sophie flooded his thoughts. How they met, how they laughed, the plans they made for the future. How had things changed so drastically? He remembered the day he first saw Sophie. It was a rainy autumn afternoon, and Thomas was buried in books at the university library, preparing for an important exam. Sophie came in, shaking water off her umbrella, her hair slightly disheveled from the rain. She smiled shyly at Thomas as she passed his table, and he felt his heart skip a beat. Later that same day, they met again at the campus cafe. Sophie was struggling with a temperamental coffee machine, and Thomas offered to help. They ended up talking for hours, completely losing track of time. Thomas remembered thinking he had never met anyone so intelligent, funny, and genuinely kind as Sophie. The months that followed were the happiest Thomas had ever known. Sophie challenged him intellectually, made him laugh like no one else, and inspired him to be a better person. They made ambitious plans for the future. She wanted to be a writer, and he dreamed of building his own business empire. Together, they believed they could conquer the world. But then graduation came, bringing difficult decisions. Thomas received an irresistible offer from a booming tech company on the West Coast. Sophie, meanwhile, had been accepted into a creative writing program on the East Coast. They tried a long-distance relationship for a while, but the demands of their new lives proved too much. The last time Thomas saw Sophie was at the airport, both of them in tears, promising to stay in touch. But like so many promises made by young lovers, this one was lost amid the whirlwind of adulthood. A knock on the door pulled him back to the present. It was Johnson, carrying a thick folder under his arm. "Mr. Laurent," "We've got some promising leads," said the detective, spreading documents across the table. "We found a string of ATM withdrawals in small towns along the coast. The pattern suggests she's moving south." Thomas examined the documents, his heart pounding. "How recent?" "The last withdrawal was 3 days ago in a town called Seabrook." Thomas felt a surge of hope. Seabrook, that's where we need to look. In the days that followed, Thomas found himself torn between his determination to find Sophie and his commitment to Claire and Anne. Every moment away from the twins was painful, but he knew he was doing it for them, for their mother, for this family that had formed under extraordinary circumstances. He spent mornings with the twins, soaking in every smile, every giggle, every milestone. In the afternoons, he threw himself into the investigation, working tirelessly to trace Sophie's path. At night, after putting the twins to bed, Thomas often found himself staring at an old photo of Sophie he had found among his college mementos. In the picture, Sophie was laughing, her face lit by the summer sun, her eyes brimming with joy and promise. Thomas would trace her face with his finger, recalling the happy times they had shared, silently vowing to find her. "Where are you, Sophie?" he'd murmur to the photo. "What happened to you?" Finally, after a week of intense planning, Thomas was ready to head to Seabrook. On the morning of his departure, he spent hours with the twins, his heart heavy at the thought of leaving them once again. "Daddy's gonna bring Mommy home," he whispered, kissing their soft foreheads. "Be good for Maria, okay?" Claire clung to his shirt with her tiny hands, as if sensing something important was about to happen. Anne, always the quiet observer, regarded him with wide, curious eyes. "I love you too more than you'll ever know," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. With one last hug and a wave to Maria, Thomas got into his car and set off for Seabrook, a small coastal town that might hold the key to the entire mystery. The drive to Seabrook was long and solitary. Thomas spent hours mentally reviewing everything he knew about the case, trying to anticipate what he might find. He also couldn't help thinking about Sophie, wondering how she must be feeling, alone, scared, far from her daughters. Upon arriving in Seabrook, Thomas immediately understood why Sophie might have chosen this place. It was a picturesque town, the kind of place where it was easy to blend in among tourists and laid-back locals. The cobblestone streets were lined with colorful houses and charming little shops. The salty ocean breeze infused everything, bringing a sense of calm that sharply contrasted with Thomas's anxiety. He checked into a small seaside hotel, setting up a discreet base for his investigations. The room was simple but cozy, with an ocean view that, under different circumstances, would have been relaxing. Thomas barely noticed it, though. As soon as he closed the door, he began organizing his documents and equipment, ready to begin his search. During the first days, Thomas roamed the town, observing closely, trying not to draw attention. He visited cafes, shops, and parks, anywhere Sophie might have sought work or shelter. Every young woman he passed made his heart leap, only to sink again when he realized it wasn't her. On the third day, however, he caught his first concrete lead. While having coffee in a local diner, Thomas overheard two waitresses chatting. "That new girl at Lighthouse Cafe is so quiet," said one. "She hardly talks to anyone. Have you noticed how nervous she gets if someone asks too many questions?" replied the other. "I bet she's running from something." Thomas's heart pounded. Could it be Sophie? He quickly finished his coffee, left a generous tip, and set off to find the Lighthouse Cafe. The cafe sat on a small hill overlooking the ocean, a cozy spot with well-worn wooden tables and large windows that let in the sunlight. Thomas chose a table in the corner, ordered a coffee, and discreetly observed the staff. And then he saw her. Sophie. Her hair was shorter and darker, but it was unmistakably her. Thomas felt as though all the air had been sucked from his lungs. She looked thinner than he remembered, with visible dark circles under her eyes. But still, it was Sophie. His Sophie. For a moment, Thomas considered approaching her immediately. His heart screamed at him to go to her, to hug her and assure her everything would be all right. But the rational part of his brain stopped him. He needed to be sure it was safe, that Eric wasn't nearby, that Sophie wouldn't run again. Over the next few days, Thomas watched Sophie from a distance, his heart breaking a little more every time he saw the fear in her eyes, the tension in her shoulders. She was using the name Sarah now, and she always seemed to look over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to recognize her at any moment. Thomas saw how polite she was with customers, but how she kept a careful distance. He noticed her hands tremble slightly when people asked too many questions, and how she withdrew whenever men entered the cafe. It was painful to see the strong, confident woman he once knew reduced to this constant state of fear. Finally, after nearly a week of observation, Thomas decided it was time to make contact. He chose a moment when the cafe was nearly empty, just before closing. Sophie was wiping down a table by the window, the sunset bathing her face in golden light. Thomas approached slowly, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure Sophie could hear it. When he was just a few steps away, he spoke softly. "Sophie." She froze, the cleaning rag slipping from her hand. Slowly, as though dreading what she might see, Sophie turned to face him. Her eyes went wide with fear and shock, and for a moment, Thomas feared she might run or scream. "Please," he said quickly, keeping his voice low and calm. "Don't be scared. I came to help." Sophie glanced around frantically, as if looking for an escape route. Her eyes, once filled with joy and life, were now wide with panic. How did you find me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's a long story," Thomas replied, taking a cautious step closer. "But what's most important is that the twins are safe. They're with me, Sophie." Sophie's eyes filled with tears at the mention of her daughters. Her hand flew to her mouth to stifle a sob. They're okay?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Thomas nodded, feeling his own throat tighten with emotion. "They're doing great. Claire and Anne. They're incredible, Sophie. So strong and brave, just like their mother." Hearing her daughters' names, Sophie let out a choked sob. Her legs seemed to give out, and Thomas instinctively moved to support her, gently guiding her to a nearby chair. I had no choice," she said, words tumbling out in a rush. "Eric, I had to protect them. You don't understand, Thomas. He could have..." "Shh," Thomas soothed, kneeling beside her. "I know. I understand now. You did what you thought was best to keep them safe." Sophie looked at him, years of fear and suffering evident in her eyes. How did you end up with them?" Thomas offered a gentle smile. "They actually ended up with me. One stormy night, someone left them at my mansion door, with a note asking me to take care of them." Sophie's eyes widened at that revelation. You've been caring for them this whole time." Thomas nodded. "From the moment I found them. They've changed my life, Sophie. They made me a better person." For a moment they were silent, the weight of everything unspoken lingering between them. Sophie seemed to be battling internally, years of fear and distrust warring with the hope Thomas offered. "But what about Eric?" she finally asked, fear clear in her voice. "He won't hurt you again," Thomas said firmly. "Not you, not the twins. I promise, Sophie, you're not alone in this fight anymore." Sophie searched Thomas's eyes, looking for any sign of deception or hesitation. She found only sincerity and resolve. Slowly, as if thawing, she began to relax. "I want to see them," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "My babies, I need to see them." Thomas nodded, a gentle smile forming on his lips. "Of course, and we can go right now if you want." Sophie hesitated, glancing around the cafe. I need to let my boss know. Get my things." "We'll take care of everything," Thomas assured her. "You don't have to worry about anything now." While Sophie went to speak to her boss and gather her belongings, Thomas made a few quick phone calls, arranging their departure and increasing security measures at the mansion. He wasn't taking any chances. When Sophie returned, she carried a small backpack that seemed to hold everything she owned. Thomas was struck by how little she had, how difficult her life had been in recent months. "Ready?" he asked gently. Sophie nodded, though fear was still evident in her eyes. "Thomas," she said in a low voice, what if they don't recognize me? What if they don't want me anymore?" Thomas felt his heart ache at the vulnerability in her voice. He stepped closer, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. "Sophie, they're your daughters. They might not consciously remember, but there's a bond between you that nothing can break. And I'm sure that the moment they see you, they'll feel it." Sophie seemed slightly reassured by his words. She took a deep breath, as though gathering all her courage. "Okay," she finally said, "let's go home." As they left the cafe together, the sun was setting over the ocean, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Thomas couldn't help but think it was a perfect symbol, a farewell to a dark chapter and the start of something hopeful. In the car, during the drive back to the mansion, Sophie was quiet, lost in her thoughts. Thomas respected her silence, understanding she was processing everything that had happened and preparing for the reunion with her daughters. Occasionally, he caught her looking at him, a mixture of gratitude and something else in her gaze, something that made Thomas's heart beat a little faster. When they finally arrived at the mansion gates, Sophie gasped at the grandeur of the place. "This is where my daughters are living?" she asked in barely more than a whisper. Thomas smiled as he parked the car. "Yes, and I promise they've been well cared for." Before they got out, Thomas turned to Sophie, his expression serious. "Sophie, I want you to know, no matter what happens from here on, you have a home here. You and the twins, you're safe now." Sophie's eyes filled with tears once more, but this time there was a tentative smile on her lips. "Thank you, Thomas," she said softly, "for everything." With one last encouraging look, Thomas stepped out of the car and walked around to open Sophie's door. Together, they headed toward the mansion entrance, where Maria awaited them with Claire and Anne. Time seemed to freeze when Sophie saw her daughters for the first time in months. She let out a sob and took a hesitant step toward them. The twins, sensing the emotion in the air, looked curiously at the newcomer. For a moment there was a tense silence charged with anticipation. Then, as though responding to a call only they could hear, Claire and Anne stretched their arms out toward Sophie, their little faces lighting up with smiles. "Mama!" Claire babbled, the word clear and strong, surprising everyone. It was as if a dam burst. Sophie rushed to her daughters, scooping them into her arms and covering them with kisses as she sobbed tears of joy. The twins laughed and babbled, clearly happy even if they didn't fully understand what was happening. Thomas watched from the side, feeling his own eyes fill with tears. It was a moment of pure magic, a family reunited against all odds. While Sophie hugged her daughters, murmuring words of love and promises, Thomas knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. This unlikely family, formed by fate and tested by trials, was finally whole. And Thomas Laurent, the man who once believed his life was complete with just his business empire, discovered that his heart had room for so much more. With Sophie and the twins, he had found a greater purpose, a deeper love than he ever imagined possible. The sun had fully set by now, but the mansion was illuminated by a warmth that seemed to come from within. It was the glow of love, of hope, and of new beginnings. Thomas stepped forward, joining the family embrace. "Welcome back," he said softly. "Welcome home." And so, amid baby laughter and tears of joy, this chapter came to a close, though their story was far from over. The future, with all its challenges and possibilities, awaited this newly reunited family. And together, they were ready to face it. The morning sun filtered through the windows of Laurent Mansion, casting a golden glow over the intimate scene unfolding in the living room. Thomas watched with a mix of joy and apprehension as Sophie cradled Claire and Anne, her tears of happiness soaking into the girls' soft hair. "My girls," Sophie whispered over and over, her voice thick with emotion. "Mommy's here now. Mommy will never leave you again." The twins, initially a bit confused by her sudden presence, seemed to instinctively sense their connection to Sophie. Claire clung tightly to her mother's shirt, while Anne touched Sophie's face with her tiny hands, as if trying to memorize every detail. Thomas felt a lump in his throat as he witnessed this reunion. It was everything he had wanted since discovering the truth about the twins. But now that it was happening, he couldn't ignore the twinge of apprehension in his chest. What would this mean for their future? After a few minutes, Sophie finally looked up, meeting Thomas's gaze. "Thank you," she said softly, "for taking care of them, for bringing us back together, for everything." Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice just yet. He moved closer, sitting beside them on the couch. "They're amazing, Sophie. You should be proud." A tremulous smile touched Sophie's lips. "I am, but there's so much I need to explain, Thomas. So many things you need to know." Thomas noticed the shift in her tone, the tension returning to her shoulders. "Let's talk," he said gently. "But first, how about some coffee? Out? You must be exhausted from your trip." Sophie agreed, grateful for the suggestion. Thomas called Maria, asking her to prepare a snack and watch the twins for a moment. Reluctantly, Sophie handed the girls over to the nanny, her eyes following them until they were out of sight. With steaming cups of coffee in hand, Thomas and Sophie sat on the veranda, overlooking the mansion's lush gardens. For a moment, they were both silent, each lost in thought. Finally, Sophie spoke, her voice quiet and tired. "I met Eric in college, not long after you and after we went our separate ways." She cast an apologetic glance at Thomas, who simply nodded for her to continue. "At first, he was charming, considerate, seemed perfect. But after we got married, things changed. It started with small criticisms, then controlling what I wore, who I saw. Before I knew it, I was isolated, completely dependent on him." Thomas felt a surge of anger in his chest, but remained silent, letting Sophie finish. "When I got pregnant, I thought things would get better. But Eric grew even more controlling. He started hitting me, said it was for the baby's own good to keep me in line." Sophie shivered at the memory. "I knew I had to leave, but I had nowhere to go, no money, no one to turn to." Thomas reached out and gently took Sophie's hand. She looked at him, grateful for the silent support. "When the twins were born, I knew I had to act. Eric was getting more violent, and I feared for their safety. So one night, while he was out of town, I grabbed the girls and ran." Sophie paused, taking a sip of coffee to steady her nerves. "I knew I couldn't keep them with me. Eric would eventually find us. So I left them with you. I remembered how kind you were, how you always talked about wanting a family. So I prayed you would take them in." Thomas's heart twisted at the trust Sophie had placed in him. "I understand now, Sophie. You did what you thought was best to protect them." Sophie nodded, silent tears rolling down her cheeks. "But now—" "Thomas, Eric filed charges. He's looking for us. He says I kidnapped the twins, that I'm an unfit mother." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. The situation was even more complicated than he'd imagined. "We'll deal with that, Sophie. Together, I have the best attorneys, and with evidence of the abuse." "But what if it's not enough?" Sophie interrupted, fear plain in her voice. "What if he gets custody?" "I can't let the girls end up with him, Thomas. I can't." Thomas leaned forward, holding both of Sophie's hands in his. "That won't happen. I promise you, Sophie. I'll do everything in my power to keep you three safe." At that moment, Thomas's phone rang. It was Johnson, his private detective. "Mr. Laurent." Johnson's voice was urgent. "We have a problem." Eric Blackwood was spotted in town. He's heading your way. Thomas felt his blood run cold. How long do we have? Minutes, at best, Johnson replied. We're on our way with reinforcements, but he has a head start. Thomas hung up, meeting Sophie's eyes. He didn't need to say a word. She understood immediately. He's coming, isn't he? She whispered, terror in her voice. Thomas nodded, standing up quickly. We'll get you and the girls to a safe place. There's a panic room in the basement. Maria. But before they could move, the screech of tires on the gravel driveway echoed through the air. Eric had arrived. Thomas placed himself protectively in front of Sophie as the front door burst open. Eric Blackwood stormed in, his wild eyes scanning the room until they landed on Sophie. You little witch, he bellowed, striding forward. Where are my children? Thomas stepped forward, blocking Eric's path. Mr. Blackwood, you're trespassing on private property. I suggest you leave immediately. Eric let out a bitter laugh. Who are you, her new fling? Get out of my way. This is between me and my wife. Sophie, trembling, found her voice. I'm not your wife anymore, Eric, and you're not going near the girls. Rage distorted Eric's features. He tried to lunge forward again, but Thomas shoved him back. Not another step, Thomas warned, his voice low and steady. The police are on their way. As if to confirm his words, sirens began to sound in the distance. Eric glanced around frantically, like a cornered animal. You don't understand, he spat, his voice tinged with desperation. They're my daughters. I have the right to see them. You lost that right the moment you raised your hand against Sophie, Thomas replied coldly. Eric let out a cry of frustration and in a sudden movement pulled out a gun from his coat. Sophie let out a muffled scream, and Thomas felt his heart freeze. I'm taking my daughters home, Eric said, pointing the gun at Thomas. And no one's going to stop me. Time seemed to slow. Thomas heard his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, felt Sophie's fear radiating behind him. But above all, he thought of Claire and Anne, innocent and vulnerable somewhere in the house. Eric, Thomas said calmly, keeping his hands visible, think about what you're doing. Do you really want your daughters growing up knowing their father is a criminal? That you threaten people with a gun? For a moment, hesitation crossed Eric's face. It was all Thomas needed. In a swift move, he lunged, grabbing Eric's arm and forcing the gun upward. A shot rang out, the bullet lodging harmlessly in the ceiling. The two men struggled as Thomas used all his strength to disarm Eric. Sophie's screams echoed in the background, begging them to stop. Suddenly, the door burst open again, and several police officers flooded the room, weapons drawn. Police! Nobody move! Realizing he was cornered, Eric finally released the gun. Within seconds, he was on the floor, handcuffed by the officers. Thomas, gasping for breath, turned to Sophie, who was shaking violently. He pulled her into his arms, feeling her sobs against his chest. It's over, he murmured, stroking her hair. It's over, Sophie. You're safe now. As Eric was led outside, screaming threats and accusations, Thomas kept Sophie firmly in his embrace. He could feel the relief emanating from her, as though a tremendous weight had been lifted. Maria appeared at the door, carrying Claire and Anne. The twins, frightened by the commotion, reached out for Sophie and Thomas. Gathering the girls, the couple held them close, forming a protective circle around them. In that moment, gazing at Sophie and the twins, Thomas knew he would do anything to safeguard this family fate had given him. We'll be okay, he whispered, kissing Sophie's forehead and then the twins. We're together now. Nothing can separate us. Sophie looked at him, tears glistening in her eyes but filled with relief and gratitude this time. Thank you, Thomas, she whispered, for everything. While the police finished processing the scene and taking statements, Thomas and Sophie and the twins remained together. The immediate danger was gone, but they all knew there was still a long road ahead. Legal battles, therapy, rebuilding trust. But at that moment, huddled together in the foyer of Laurent Mansion, they were simply a family. a family that had faced the worst and come out stronger. A family that, against all odds, had found their way back to one another. And as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the scene, Thomas made a silent promise. He would protect this family with everything he had, because now he knew, beyond a doubt, that this, Sophie, Claire, Anne, was all that truly mattered. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, it was filled with hope. And together, they were ready to face it. As night fell over Laurent Mansion, a sense of calm finally began to settle. The police had left, taking Eric with them. The silence that followed stood in stark contrast to the chaos of earlier. Thomas, Sophie, and the twins moved to the living room, seeking solace in each other's presence. The girls, exhausted by the commotion, soon fell asleep in their parents' arms. "What happens now?" Sophie asked softly, her eyes meeting Thomas's over the heads of the sleeping Claire and Anne. Thomas exhaled gently, considering the question. "Now we rebuild, together. We have a lot to sort out, legal issues, custody, your long-term safety. But most importantly, we're all here, together and safe." Sophie nodded, a small smile forming on her lips. "I never thought I'd have this again, a family, a safe home." "You deserve it, Sophie," Thomas said earnestly. "You and the girls deserve peace and happiness." For a moment they sat in silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts. The soft ticking of the clock on the wall and the gentle breathing of the twins were the only sounds in the room. "Thomas," Sophie began hesitantly, "I know it's a lot to ask, after everything you've already done, but can we stay here, at least until all this is resolved?" Thomas felt his heart expand with affection. "Sophie, this is your home now, yours and the girls. For as long as you want, for as long as you need. We're in this together, remember?" Tears shimmered in Sophie's eyes, but this time they were tears of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. At that moment, as though sensing the emotion, Claire stirred in her sleep, snuggling closer to Sophie's chest. Anne, meanwhile, clutched Thomas's shirt more firmly. The couple exchanged a glance of mutual understanding. There was a lot to be done, many challenges to face, but at that moment, with their daughters sleeping peacefully in their arms, they knew they could face anything. Thomas leaned in gently, pressing a light kiss to Sophie's forehead. "Welcome home," he murmured. And so, as the night wore on, the Laurent family rested, together and secure. The future, with all its uncertainties and possibilities, lay ahead. But for now, in this hard-won moment of peace, they were exactly where they belonged, together. The chapter of Eric's threat had closed, but their story, the story of a family forged through adversity and united by love, was only just beginning. Time passed, bringing the healing and stability Sophie, Thomas, and the twins so desperately needed. Laurent Mansion, once merely a symbol of Thomas's business success, now pulsed with the life and love of a true family. 6 months after the confrontation with Eric, Sophie finally received the news she had been waiting for. The divorce was granted, and she was awarded full custody of Claire and Anne. The living room filled with laughter and tears of joy when the news arrived, with Thomas hugging Sophie tightly, while the twins played happily at their feet, unaware of the moment's significance, but feeling the happiness radiating from their parents. "It's over," Sophie whispered, her face pressed against Thomas's chest. "It's really over." Thomas kissed the top of her head, his own voice tight with emotion. "A new beginning for all of us." In the following months, Thomas and Sophie deepened their relationship. What began as a hesitant reconnection, initially driven by their shared concern for the twins, blossomed into a mature, profound love. Late nights were spent talking after the girls were asleep, sharing hopes, fears, and dreams for the future. On a sunny spring morning, Thomas surprised Sophie with a request that would change their lives forever. "Sophie," he said, holding her hands while they sat in the garden watching Claire and Anne play, I want to officially adopt the twins. I want us to be a family in every sense of the word." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "Thomas, are you sure? They're already yours in every way that matters." "Absolutely sure," he replied with a smile. "They're my daughters, Sophie. Our daughters. I want to make it official." The adoption process was finalized a few months later, coinciding with the twins' second birthday. Laurent Mansion was decorated with balloons, ribbons, and colorful banners. Friends, family, and even George, the kind neighbor from Millbrook who had helped Thomas in his search for Sophie, were present to celebrate. In the center of the room stood a large cake adorned with little fairies, Claire's favorite, and butterflies, Anne's fascination. Thomas and Sophie stood side by side, each holding one of the twins, as the guests sang "Happy Birthday." "Make a wish, my darlings," Sophie encouraged, helping Claire and Anne blow out the candles together. Amid the applause, Thomas reflected on how drastically his life had changed in the past 2 years. From a solitary executive focused solely on business, he had become a devoted father and a loving partner. He had found a purpose greater than any business success could offer. Inspired by his own journey and determined to make a difference, Thomas announced during the party the creation of the Laurent Foundation, dedicated to helping victims of domestic abuse and children at risk. "Our family got a happy ending," he said, his arm around Sophie, the twins sitting on their laps, "and we want to make sure other families get that chance too." The days that followed were filled with precious moments of daily life. Mornings began with Claire and Anne jumping into their parents' bed, demanding pancakes and story time. Afternoons were spent in the garden, with Thomas teaching the girls to ride bicycles while Sophie took photos, her laughter echoing across the property. Evenings ended with the family curled up in the library, Thomas reading stories while Sophie provided silly voices for the characters, much to the twins' delight. On one such night, with Claire and Anne finally asleep in their arms, Thomas looked at Sophie, his heart overflowing with love. "Did you ever imagine we'd be here?" he asked softly. Sophie smiled, leaning in to kiss him gently. "Not in my wildest dreams, but I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world." As they carried the girls to bed, Thomas reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this point. Challenges had been overcome, wounds had healed, and a love that once seemed lost had been rediscovered and fortified. Standing at the door of the twins' room, watching his daughters sleep peacefully, Thomas and Sophie knew they had found something truly special, a family built not just by blood ties, but by choice, love, and determination. The future stretched out before them, brimming with promise and possibility. And together, as the Laurent family, they were ready to embrace it with open arms. Gently closing the door to the twins' room, Thomas and Sophie walked hand in hand to the mansion's veranda. The night was clear, the stars above reflecting the hope in their hearts. Thomas pulled Sophie close, wrapping his arms around her. For a moment, they stood quietly, simply savoring each other's presence and the hard-won peace they now enjoyed. "You know," Thomas began, his voice soft in the night stillness, "I used to think success in business was all I needed. But now," he paused, looking at Sophie with eyes full of love, "now I know that this, our family, is true success." Sophie smiled, snuggling closer. "We went through so much to get here," she reflected, "but every moment was worth it." Thomas nodded, placing a tender kiss on Sophie's forehead. "And this is only the beginning. We have a whole life ahead of us, filled with moments like this." As the couple remained in their embrace, contemplating the future they had built together, a gentle breeze carried the scent of garden roses. It was as though nature itself was celebrating the love and happiness that now filled Laurent Mansion. Inside the next room, Claire and Anne slept soundly, likely dreaming of the day's adventures and joys, and their parents, united by love and strengthened by the trials they had faced, stood ready to guide them through whatever challenges the future might bring. The story of Thomas, Sophie, Claire, and Anne, the story of the Laurent family, was no traditional fairy tale. It was a narrative of perseverance, second chances, and the transformative power of love. A story that proved sometimes the happiest endings are the ones we fight for with courage, compassion, and an open heart. And so, under the starlit sky, with the distant sound